welcome back to another episode of Steelers Afternoon Drive. I'm Zachary Smith. No Alan Saunders today. Alan going to be on vacation for the next week and some change, so hope he enjoys his time doing that. Got to call in some reinforcements. Derrick Bell, also of Steelers Now, joining the show. What's going on, pal?
Coming in hot off the bench, man. I'm excited. It's a steamy one out here in Kentucky. So I just
You
got back
said
from
coming
inside.
in hot off the bench, and it
Yeah,
immediately made me think about how we like to throw around the dream team meme
yeah.
with Steelers Now. Which player are you from the dream team?
I'm a bench player for sure. I
But
can't take
that
credit.
bench was elite though too. I mean, there's not a bad player obviously on that dream team roster. So
Yeah, that is true.
are you Christian Leitner? Because
You
you're
know
a
I
Duke
got
guy.
yeah. But I say I gotta get loaded by Duke guys. But I would like to I would like to say I at least get minutes, like get playing time.
That's true. Yeah, I
Uh,
just came to mind because of the Duke connection there.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I might be like the Clyde Drexler, like maybe like the backup, like
Okay.
guard off the bench. But no, I'm excited to get on here and talk some ball, man. It's been an uneventful like last like week or two. There's not a ton going on, but I feel like everybody,
Facts. Yeah.
Allen's on vacation. Everybody's kind of getting their last bit of freedom before football consumes basically all of our lives for the next hopefully 5 months or whatever. So
Yeah.
I'm excited about that.
Hope that goes into February when we're still talking about Steelers ball. That
Mm-hmm.
would be a lot of fun.
Yes,
But
it would.
anyways, with that being said, a little bit of a mailbag Q&A, whatever you want to call it, which Derrick is just doing this basically all of his Friday because on his personal channel. He'll also be doing that later on. So appreciate him taking some time for us before he does that later on. But yeah, so we'll just start with John here. He says, which position group are you and Derrick most excited to watch during camp? Now, for me, it's funny because you say excited, but so I don't know if it's excitement so much as like I'm like, oh, this is going to be. There's just so many good players to fill out these spots. Like this is going to be such a tough competition. But my answer is wide receiver. But it's not because there's just like a surplus of talent there. It's just somebody's got to separate themselves from the pack. Like Calvin Austin was kind of that guy for me early here in the spring. Is that going to translate to training camp? Does Roman Wilson take that big leap from OTAs to training camp that we saw Joey Porter do as a rookie, because that's kind of where like he started the ball and become the Joey Porter Jr. that we eventually saw in the regular season. So for me, I would say first and foremost, the receivers is where I want to see who kind of separates themselves from the pack. So I'm excited to watch that position group. It's just funny to use the word excited when talking about the battle that's going to go on there.
Yeah, because I think nervous would probably more accurately describe a
Yeah.
lot of people, including like the fan base and like ourselves as well, about how that position group's going to play out. I mean, the receiver thing would have probably been my second guess or answer here to this question. But number one for me is probably going to be corner, just because I feel like one,
If I had a second one, that would be the second one for me.
yeah,
So one and two.
I'm a DB guy, so like I've got to go with that. But I think there are a couple interesting storylines, right? Like, what does the rotation look like throughout camp? Is there anybody that kind of steps to the forefront of the slot corner position? Like, what does that look like? I
Yeah.
think that we'll have a pretty good idea once we get into like the first or second preseason game of like if they are going to mix and match personnel. Maybe you have an early down nickel and then a passing down nickel. Because Cam Sutton's going to have the chance to practice and play, but
Yeah.
I think play in the preseason. But we
Mm-hmm.
aren't going to get to actually see him play in the regular season for the first half of the year. So I think figuring out who's going to be the guy, and then I think it makes an interesting point about just the outside corners too, right? Because Sutton's the best year of his career was his final year in Pittsburgh, which he played outside. And I think as we sit here today, like I think if he was eligible to play week one and not suspended, he would probably be the top cornerback, like backup on the outside too. So he was probably going to be a guy that was going to be wearing multiple hats. But without him for the first half of the year, we're one injury away from like a guy like Corey Trice, Darius Rush, one of those guys playing 100% of snaps. Like that's the thing about corner is you're just one injury away from having to play a lot. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's an interesting storyline. And then like the final one for me to drive home that point would just be I'm very excited about what Joey Porter Jr. is going to do in year two. And I think that the matchups between him and George Pickens, like a lot of those went viral last year, training camp
Yeah.
videos and such. But I'm really excited just to see both those guys continue on their trajectory and seeing what both of those guys look like in 2024.
I guess if I had to throw one more out there, it's linebackers, but I'll throw all of them in one group, outside and inside, because I want to see, like, are we going to see Cole Holcomb early on in training camp? Tomlin kind of alluded to the fact that it wouldn't be too much longer at the end of OTAs before we
Yeah.
were able to see Cole Holcomb get back on the field. And there is a heck of a job opening at edge 4 as well. So even if you want to talk about the guys on the outside, like, we all expect Nick Herbig to elevate into that edge 3 role from last year, which I think he should. I think you should see it
Hmm.
some snaps and be the number one reserve to Highsmith and Watt. But is it going to be Jeremiah Moon that takes that other spot, David Perales, Kyron Johnson, or is that maybe a spot to look at if they're not impressed there? Could it be somebody that's on a different roster right now?
Yeah.
So, I think that there's
Yeah.
a job to win there, at least one.
And kind of all three of those positions, kind of for various different reasons and different scenarios that could be in play. Those are positions that they could look to upgrade, like you said, from other rosters, guys that get cut as we get through the preseason or whatever. I mean, that's the important thing to note too, is while the meat and potatoes of the roster is very much already in place here, barring some unforeseen move that we just don't see coming and we rarely see, especially in Pittsburgh. We're not going to mention a certain wide receiver in San Francisco, but the meat and potatoes of the roster is in play, but there are going to be a couple of players probably make the final 53 that aren't actually on the Steelers roster today. And I think that's really, training camp is a good way to kind of decide those things, because you're going to get the chance to see these guys practice with live contact and in a competitive setting. And I'm just excited that we're going to have football, but I'm excited about those position groups specifically.
Yeah, if I was making a prediction, I'm actually starting to think, if you were to tell me they're only going to add one spot, I'm actually
Hmm.
starting to lean them adding a slot corner instead of a receiver,
I
because
can definitely
of
see that happening.
wanting to add another body with Cam's suspension. Like, even if it is bringing back like a Shannon Sullivan because they're comfortable
Hmm.
with that, or I mean, people bring up like a Patrick Peterson reunion too, but like uh, that didn't go well. Like, inside, you got to be able to tackle. I would say that's his biggest deficiency. Like, I don't know that he's built to play in the slot. I would much rather have Shannon Sullivan be the rundown slot and then figure out whether it's Josiah Scott, Beanie Bishop, somebody else contributing on pass downs.
Yeah, I mean, I think perfect scenario, one of the guys on the roster kind of, again, steps to the
Sure.
forefront, kind of takes
Hmm.
that job just naturally. But again, that's the thing. It's very possible that couldn't happen. I mean, we're talking about guys in some of these positional groups. You mentioned receiver, but we're talking about a lot of bodies there that were, quite frankly, they were cheap additions. They weren't wanted by their previous team. They weren't splash signings. Look at Beanie Bishop; he was an undrafted free agent. Josiah Scott, a guy that been on the practice squad. So we're talking about guys that don't have a lot of pedigree necessarily, and we're expecting them to take advantage of a really good opportunity. But there is probability says that odds are that that's not going to happen, especially at all three of those positions we talked about. But it's going to be really really interesting to kind of watch unfold. But yeah, I do agree with you. I think that a slot corner addition definitely makes sense if there is a guy that becomes available out there, especially for cheap.
You know what? Let's just add the guy that Zach wants us to talk about here, Paul Skeens. No, it doesn't play into the Steelers conversation at all. Although football is a part of his warm-up routine, which I love watching, but I also love the fact that every once in a while we got Derrick Bell talking about baseball because of Paul Skeens in Pittsburgh.
Man, I'm not a huge baseball guy, especially if you follow me for a long time. I mean, I keep up a little bit with the Reds, a little bit with the Pirates, but just very, very on a casual basis. My mental bandwidth cannot handle rooting or covering for another team or sport. But I mean, what he's done, man, has been pretty incredible. I mean, you look at some of the numbers that people tweeting out. I mean, it's fantastic. I think he got announced today as the All-Star starter. I
He
mean,
is, yeah.
it's almost been my thing has been just watching him pitch is just really enjoyable, especially from my perspective of not being a huge baseball fan, but also just the excitement that he's generated. I feel like around the Pirates and around the city seems to be pretty cool. And it's made me honestly reminisce a lot about when I was a kid and we had, Big Ben's rookie year and that magical
Yeah.
run they went on. I don't think that
Mhm.
run is probably in play for the Pirates in terms of a deep postseason run.
Right.
But it's cool to watch. I feel like a lot of the special players that you see, I hate to throw out generational, but it seems like that he probably fits that billing, at least
I
to start
mean,
out. But like
yeah,
when you get the start of like a generational type player in your city, it just changes the morale, it changes the mood. And just the overall expectations of where the franchise could be headed, and I'm really excited for Pirates fans because I know they've been through a lot of tough seasons and losing. So yeah, I'm happy for all my fellow Steelers and Pirates fans that are getting to watch something really, really special right now.
it's entertaining, man. Like you said, for even people that aren't into the game of baseball that much, like, not that you're like a wrestling guy either, but like the way that
Hmm.
I've equated it to people, in that fashion, kind of bringing that in the conversation is it's like showing a non-wrestling fan WrestleMania. Like it's one
Right.
event where that is the peak of the entertainment that they can see within that realm. Watching Paul Steens right now is the peak of entertainment for baseball. And that's why the league is pushing him so much. That's why he is starting for the NL All-Star team, despite him only having 11 starts under his belt.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the entertainment value has certainly been there. And watching him live up to the billing and exceed that has certainly been enjoyable. So I appreciate Zach allowing me to talk a little bit of Paul Steens on Steelers Afternoon Drive. Actually, that's back-to-back days because he was pitching yesterday as Alan and I were recording. So we ended up having a conversation about him
Nice.
yesterday as well. Dave says, I always assume the worst when it comes to O-line play. How many weeks does the fan base give this new squad before they start bashing them? I'll hang up and listen.
I will say that it won't take very long because I mean, fan bases in general, they just lack patience. And I think that with this group, there's going to be some growing pains, especially out of the gate. I mean, you gotta remember,
Mhm.
like, this is a pretty young group. They're gonna be starting three guys that have started less than, a dozen games at the NFL level between, two rookies. I expect Zach Frazier to start from day one. I am hoping that Troy Fautanu starts from day one. Roderick Jones moving to a new position. Of course, like he only has, less than a dozen starts under his belt. So, I mean, it's going to be difficult to get all of those guys to hit the ground running from week one. Now, there will be people on social media that are going to be frustrated and they're going to say, like, oh, we've invested so much in the offensive line, all these top picks, and they've signed two free agents, two guards in free agency to decent contracts. Why are they not performing well? It's a new scheme. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of young players getting acclimated to the NFL level. It's going to take some time. I think that the best case scenario is that you see a little bit of a uptick or development over the course of like maybe the first month or two, and they really hit their stride like once the schedule gets a lot more difficult in the second half. So um,
Yeah.
to his point, there are going to be people that are going to prematurely jump the ship. I would just say the course, especially for a guy like Broderick, who I think you and I have talked a lot about this, but this is kind of a 2 to 3 year project type of player, and someone that you
Yeah.
really need to maintain that long lens viewpoint of in terms of his development.
Like, I'm super optimistic about what this line will be by the end of the season.
Sure.
But early on, I agree with you. I think there's going to be growing pains, but I would say that about the entirety of the offense in general. When you talk about a new
Right.
offensive coordinator, new quarterback, so really just like with how much change they've undergone on that side of the ball, I just expect them to not get out of the gate super fast. And that's why, despite it being super odd to me, I actually do not take issue whatsoever with them being fully loaded on the back end with the division at that point. Like, I kind of like the fact that it's, Atlanta, Denver, out of the gate. And hopefully by the time that they get to those divisional games, week 11 and beyond, that offensive line is completely gelled at that point. We know who our five starters are. They stay healthy and we're just locked and loaded, ready to go on a run at that point. So
Yeah.
while I understand the gripes that people have had about it, I kind of looked at it as a blessing that they didn't see the division until week 11 for that reason.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, that stretch of games, you can look at it both at a positive or a negative way. But that stretch of games, I mean, it's going to tell you whether or not the Steelers belong in the postseason. Whether they make it or not is one thing or another. But, if they go out and they compete against that schedule the last 7 or 8 weeks, it'll give you some optimism headed into the playoffs should they make it. And I think that even though the Steelers have finished seasons in recent years fairly strong, they've either barely missed the playoffs or they've gotten in and then, suffered pretty bad losses in the first round. I mean, what better way to get you ready to play in the postseason than playing against that schedule? So, and like you said, I think
Yeah.
that there is some value in terms of them not playing as good of teams at the beginning of the season when this offense is starting to gel. But I think too is just I think there's just going to be a filling out period with the entire offense, like you mentioned, just Arthur Smith, like learning how to use his personnel, seeing what works, what doesn't. I think we're going to see some flashes, I hope, but it wouldn't surprise me if they struggled even in like the preseason. I know they were lights out last year, the preseason, and then started the regular season terribly. Hopefully that doesn't happen like again, but it wouldn't even surprise me if this group struggled in the preseason just with, like you mentioned, how many moving parts there are.
Yeah. That's the preseason I'm super intrigued by. Just the totality of the offense again, like watching Justin Fields do against teams in the preseason. I feel like it's going to be fun if he sees like any like third stringers, even potentially
Yeah,
when he's playing. So, um, but yeah, to answer this question, the frustration for a lot of people, I feel like will come very early, probably as early as week 1. But big picture, that's what we got to look at here when you talk about this many young players. And I do think it's going to be for the better. I would rather them, trial by fire and struggle early on, as long
sure.
as they can keep that same group of players together and healthy. So, Nick says, what are reasonable expectations fans should have for each of the rookies during training camp? No, the Steelers typically are more cautious with their rookies, but is it too optimistic to believe some could play their way into the starting lineup before the first game?
I had a really good conversation with Brandon Thorne on my channel about a week ago, and we were talking about setting realistic expectations for the Steelers offensive line. And,
Yeah.
he gave really good insight on each of those players. But one of the key points that we talked about in that video was there is no better way for these guys to get acclimated than to go up against the Steelers front. Like, if you think about it, the
Yeah.
tackles are going to be going up against Alex Highsmith, TJ Watt, in practice. Even a guy like Nick Herbig, like if a guy's not getting first team reps, they're going to get thrown immediately into the fire and play some of the best players in the NFL in a training camp setting. I think there's huge value in that. From a competition standpoint, and then even a guy like Zach Frazier, there are going to be times where he's going to be asked to block guys like Cam Hayward or even Keanu Benton, who I think is going to take a nice year or two leap. So I think the expectations for those guys would just be that they compete and they get better over time, over the course of camp, and you see them get more comfortable playing at the NFL level. But I do think, there's going to be times probably in training camp where they're getting beat up pretty bad. I mean, those guys on the defensive side of the ball, though, the guys that I just mentioned, they get paid a lot of money. They've made a lot of Pro Bowls, a lot of All Pros for a reason. So I think, it's kind of one of those iron sharpens iron type of deals there. But I think you mentioned Roman Wilson a little bit earlier. Like, he's definitely a
Yeah.
guy that I think, for me specifically, I want to see like how he's evolved kind of as a route runner and like what his deployment looks like. Is he going to be someone that they kind of ease into a very specific kind of niche role, or is this a guy who's going to have more put on his plate than he had at Michigan? And I'm really excited to see what that is. So those are kind of my expectations, just for guys to come in and compete. And, hopefully we see a good amount of development as we get into the preseason.
I get the notion here that Nick's talking about with the way that they are cautious with their rookies and bring them along slowly. Obviously, a ton of people within the fan base would have liked to have seen Broderick earlier than we did, Joey Porter Jr. earlier than we did, and Keanu Benton while we did see him, but probably playing more snaps than we saw him play. At the same time, those guys have kind of credited the way they were brought along for how well they played once they were in the position that they
Mm-hmm.
were in playing more. In that same breath, though, when you look at the state of the Steelers roster right now, with how many holes they needed filled immediately by drafting these rookies, I don't know that they necessarily have that much of a choice. Like, these are going to
Right.
be their best players at these spots. Like, sure, once we saw how last season was going for Levi Wallace, it was clear that Joey Porter Jr. would be an upgrade. But like going into the season, we didn't feel that way about Levi Wallace. I at least thought that he would be a stopgap option to buy Joey Porter Jr. sometime. And who could have thought that Larry Ogunjobi would play the way that he did? Maybe you and I, because he didn't have the greatest year even before that on a 1-year prove-it deal to earn
Right.
himself a new 3-year deal, but neither here nor there. But yeah, when I look at the rookies that they brought in, they're guys that they kind of immediately need to step in. I mean, Zach Frazier to me immediately is going to be a better option than Nate Herbig. Roman Wilson, even if he's not going to beat out, Calvin, like he's got to be an integral part of this game.
Sure.
This team in year one. And that's why I kind of brought up earlier too. I'm not panicked about the fact that all reports kind of indicate he struggled quite a bit at rookie mini camp and OTAs, just because that was the case with Joey last year, and
Mhm.
maybe we kind of see the blueprint there. Like rookies get better a lot faster, just because they're pretty bad when they first come in, and that process kind of jumps. So
I think
yeah,
too, it kind of speaks to a little bit of a philosophical change. I think with the organization as well. Like you
mhm,
mentioned, some of these rookies are going to come into a situation where they're immediately going to be viewed as the most talented players at their position. Now that might not necessarily mean that they're going to be the best from day one, but like they definitely clearly have the most talent, and they're going to need them earlier. But I think like back in the day when Kober was the GM, it seemed like they always tried to sign, cheaper, decent free agents to where they're like stopgap options, maybe like a half season or a year stopgap options, and then immediately like draft over them in the draft. And it kind of gave them a little bit of a failsafe. But with this year, just the way that the Steelers kind of moved in free agency, maybe it was them making a little bit more of a splash signing with Patrick Queen. Maybe they didn't feel like they had the resources to go out there and address some of those other holes that they had, receiver and center. I mean, we talked about it all through the draft process. They went into the draft with some pretty significant needs, and whoever they were going to take at those positions was going to have to log a pretty substantial amount of snaps. So I'm
yeah.
interested to see how that plays out. But like you said, I mean, I think I just want to see continued development. Development's not necessarily linear; it's not guaranteed, but I do think that over the course of time, training camp, preseason, we'll be able to get a good feel for how confident we should be in these guys come week one if they have to play a lot.
Yeah, I mean, and speaking of the wide receivers, I even put in my post, please do not ask us about Brandon Ayuk. Now,
Hmm.
people have kind of found a way to circumvent that by still asking about other receivers. Because Cam said, are there any
Clever.
updates on the Steelers and Michael Thomas? And Max wants to know, what is the deal with wide receiver two? I get it's overblown and all, but I truly don't think Calvin Austin and Roman Wilson can fill that spot right now. Too small and unproven. Van, at least prototypical size, but looks like the ball is just going to go to George and the tight ends with us running more from the outside looking in. As far as Michael Thomas, literally outside of the initial point of contact, haven't heard a thing regarding that. Like they might as well have kicked the tires, but to me, I don't think that one comes to fruition predictively. I also kind of question the fit. Um, just because as we've kind of even I know he hasn't been healthy much over the last few years, but he's played more in the slot as of late. Like to me, I'm looking for if they were looking for a receiver, it's got to be somebody that can play on the outside. Um, and I'm not saying Michael Thomas can't, but he's played a lot more in the slot. Obviously, everybody makes the jokes about it, but kind of specializes in those quick slant game. I question the fit, whether it would even work in Pittsburgh. As far as other receivers in general, man, I think they're going to take that search right up until the season. Like sure, they're going to be on the lookout to see what gets cut, from rosters around the league. I'm sure Omar still is interested in acquiring somebody via trade if that has to be that route as opposed to free agency. But I'm not saying that something for sure will, but when you look at the state of the roster, I tend to agree. Like it's George, it's Pat in that order, and then the running backs probably. Like I think those are your four best eligibles right now, are George, Pat, Najee, and Jalen Warren.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, man, there's very very little on the free agent market at this point in time. I mean, you're
Sure.
looking
Yeah.
at guys that are just bottom of the barrel kind of retreads, if you would. I mean, I know Michael Thomas is like a big name because he got off to that phenomenal start to his career in New Orleans, but like you mentioned, he just hasn't been healthy to me, and I think that he was already not the like he wasn't this like freak athlete when he came into the league anyway. He was just extremely
Mhm.
refined, and a really good technician. And just after all the injuries and stuff, you have to wonder about like how much is he still going to be able to separate and what's he going to run? If assuming he even stays healthy, how dynamic of a playmaker is he really going to be? Is he going to be good enough to keep a guy like Roman Wilson or Calvin Austin even off the field? But I do think they're going to continue to ask about guys that could or could not be on the market. But I mean, we don't often see really good players traded during the 53-man cut. I mean, there
Sure.
could be somebody available, but a true difference maker. It seems like Cortland Sutton's staying put. I have no clue why the Niners would trade Brandon Ayuk in the first place, but it seems like they're probably going to want to run it back anyway because I mean they're one of the favorites for the Super Bowl. I
Yeah.
just
At,
I
at the
think they're
very
going to
least,
definitely
just treat it
try.
like a last dance for
Yeah,
San
I
Fran. Yeah.
mean, I think they're definitely going to try, but I mean, it takes two to tango. There's got to be a team willing to give something up in order for you to make a trade happen, and I don't think that that's necessarily going to happen. And I've said this a couple times just in different forums, but I don't know that I subscribe to the notion that like wide receiver two just isn't important. I think that viewing it that way is just extremely silly, in my opinion. Even if I do think that Freiermuth's going to be able to, handle a good amount of volume, especially than he did in the previous version of this offense.
Mhm.
I mean, you win on offense with playmakers on the outside. Like if you don't have a difference maker at quarterback, and I don't think that Russell Wilson necessarily is that type of difference maker where he's going to make everyone else significantly better, one of those elite guys that you win because of. I don't think he's in that tier anymore. So ideally, you want to surround that guy with as much firepower as you possibly can. And I think that Omar Khan's offseason will probably be judged on what steps Calvin Austin takes, what steps Roman Wilson can take really early on, and how good this offense can be. And I don't necessarily think that I mean, it would be great if they were top 10, but I mean, if they're not a top half of the league offense, I think that there is going to be some criticism come Omar's way about how he handled the wide receiver position if, you know, those things don't come to fruition. They don't show, a good amount of improvement on offense.
Just a weird process. Like I don't get me wrong, I'm not behind those doors. I'm not a fly on the wall, so I have no clue what that's been like. But they traded Deontay Johnson months ago, March, during free agency. Like they wanted to meet with Mike Williams, didn't happen. Threw a
Hmm.
low ball offer to Tyler Boyd, which I mean, you saw the offer that what he ended up signing for in Tennessee. Clearly, nobody valued him in the way that he wanted to be valued in free agency.
Sure.
But that was it. Like it's kind of been crickets. We've obviously heard that they've been reaching out to anybody that's willing to listen on the trade market,
Yeah.
but it's hard for me to understand the process. Like I fully expected Deontay Johnson to not be on this roster in 2024, but like the timing, like it didn't. Why did it have to happen right then? You know what I
Well,
mean? Like what was it made me think like there was something already in the works at wide receiver. They had a plan, but then it doesn't seem like there was.
yeah. And I'm just the film and numbers guy, not the sources guy. But I did hear something about a week ago that I thought was actually like really interesting. Alan and I were talking about it off camera, but the Steelers were going to cut Deontay, like straight up, like they were going to cut him, and basically there was very little interest on the trade market for him. I mean, there was like only a few teams that even really inquired or were really interested in taking on his contract, with which I personally think is kind of wild because I think
Yeah.
that Carolina got a pretty solid player for basically a guy that they were going to cut. Like Carolina was going to cut Dante Jackson,
Mhm.
so it's kind of
Yeah.
the funny that the way that things played out, and hopefully, I think that it works out well for both of those teams. It could be a rare case where we don't see player for player trades very often in the NFL, but hopefully this is a rare player for player trade that works out for both franchises because Carolina needed somebody that could handle a good amount of volume in their passing game. They didn't have a separator last year on
Mhm.
that Panthers offense, which is a significant problem. And the Steelers needed somebody to complement Joey Porter Jr. I think Jackson's skill set is a nice kind of change from what Porter can do. So I think it's a nice like mix and match. I'm not really sure what he has left. Hopefully he can stay healthy. But yeah, I mean, I do agree with you. The timing of everything is interesting. But like one thing that I think is fair, even though I largely have agreed with the vast majority of decisions that Khan's made, and I think he's done a really good job given what he was handed over by Kevin Colbert.
Mhm.
You know, there's not really any room for excuses, right? Like we just came off of a extremely good draft class for wide receivers. I mean, one of the best that we've seen in recent years, in my opinion. And there were guys available in free agency, but to not upgrade it really at all, with the exception of, now you're forcing a third round pick into a pretty significant role from the jump. It does put a lot of pressure on some of these young guys taking pretty big leaps going forward. So we'll see how that plays out. But like you said, it's one of the things we're watching for most in camp, and see how those guys compete against, hopefully a decent cornerback room.
Yeah, man, I don't know. Well, in the last question we got here kind of plays into all this. Somebody said, "What is your prediction in terms of Pat Fryermuth's production within this offense?"
I mean, the Falcons last year were fifth at targets to tight ends. Now,
Yep.
some of that plays into, like, if you play that amount of 12 or 13 personnel, obviously you got a lot of tight ends on the field. They're going to see a lot of volume. But I even think, just with the current construction of the offense, they should be looking to utilize him as much as possible, even if they're not as 12 or 13 personnel heavy. Like last year, the Falcons, I think, were dead last by like 15 or 20% in terms of 11 personnel usage. I don't think that they'll be that low this year. But I still think you're going to see Freiermuth a lot play in the slot. And hopefully, like I said, be featured more in the offense in terms of being more intentional about getting him the ball. I mean, there was times last year, I know you and I talked about this, but there was times last year, even before he got dinged up with the hamstring, there was times in the beginning of the season, they weren't even they designed hardly any plays for him. Like, he was just a total non-factor on offense, not being featured at all. And obviously, I think that this year's Steelers just cannot afford to do that.
From the time that he became the offensive coordinator with the Titans to his last year as head coach with the Falcons, tight ends received 656 targets within Arthur Smith's offense, an average of 131.2 per season. Now, a lot of people talk about the production that Jonnu Smith had last year behind Kyle Pitts and kind of taking that away. I ask, who in the world is the Jonnu Smith on the Steelers roster? Like, I don't think that that's there. Like, I don't think that there's somebody that's there to take away those targets. So
Yeah,
that's
I
kind of the
think
way I'm looking at
too.
it. I think Pat's in for a huge year.
I do think too, like you mentioned with Washington. I mean, because Washington's build is so unique, with him being 6'7", huge, extremely good blocker, and like, it's going to come in handy for the Steelers. But
Sure.
he can only do specific things as a receiver. Like, he can run the seams, he can get on the flat, he can run after catch a little bit, but he's a very straight line, linear type of player who is not going to be somebody who's going to be able to run like a robust route tree. Like, he just can't sink his hips and drop the way that
Sure.
even like functional receiving tight ends can do. So I think that there's going to be a lot of people that are saying like, well, why can't they just throw Darnell Washington 45, 50 passes this year? Like, I just don't. I mean, I said this when I evaluated Darnell coming out, which I gave him a second round grade, and I liked him a decent amount. He's never going to be able to be a guy that's going to catch more than like probably 2 passes on average a game, just because there's only limited ways you can get him the ball. Like, could they get him the ball more in the red zone? Yes. The thing with Johnny
Yeah.
that's kind of interesting is he's a really good yards after catch guy. So who is that guy going to be? Is that Jalen Warren? I think Jalen Warren may be featured a little bit more in the screen game. That's kind of been my like Galaxy brain thought of how they replace that production. But we'll just have to see. It's going to be interesting. We'll get a good look at that, come preseason.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all we got. Good stuff. Really enjoy any time that we're able to bring the audience into the show with these Q&As, mailbags, however you want to word it, type of deals. But Derek, tell the people they can find you.
Yeah, at Steelers_DB on Twitter and YouTube. All my written work can be found at SteelersNow.com. I will be streaming about 7 p.m. Eastern time. So after you get done watching this video, you can either come join in on the phone. We'll be talking some Steelers, maybe a little NFL draft, answering some questions, kind of in a similar format, really laid back. Just talking about, football as we get closer and closer to training camp. So if y'all want to head over there, be sure to do that or catch the replay, whatever. I'm really excited about that later on tonight.
There we go. Be sure to do that. Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell on this YouTube channel. Hit us in the comments with your thoughts on anything that we talked about, a question for a future episode. Derek will actually be back with me one of the days next week with Alan being on vacation, so you won't have to wait too much longer to get some more DB in your life. Leave us a 5-star review and subscribe if you're listening somewhere else, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. You can find Steelers Afternoon Drive there. Follow me everywhere, Zachary Smith, PGH. Also be sure to follow Steelers Afternoon Drive if you are on TikTok, 90-second clips of the show. If you are not into the full form version of it, if you have a very short attention span like myself. So be sure to follow us on TikTok as well. But that's all for this episode. Shout out to Derrick Bell for joining me again, and we'll see you guys next week. Until then, have a good weekend. Bye-bye.